Hi, the 7th and 8th grade lesson for this Sunday, April 15th, is Jesus Cleanses the Temple, lesson 29, and it's found in Mark 11, verses 12 to 19. Really is actually two lessons in one. The first one is pretty short, but an important one. As far as the key points go, true worship and respect for God's house is important. As we're talking about Jesus cleanses the temple, we're going to see what made him so upset with what was going on at his father's house. And point number 2, God expects that we will produce fruits of faith. Now, as this story begins, it really begins with this episode where Jesus curses this fig tree. This takes place Monday of Holy Week. Now, Jesus is staying outside of the city in Bethany, a small town that was about 3 miles away from Jerusalem. And he and his disciples set out on Monday morning to head back to Jerusalem without breakfast. Now, Jesus sees this fig tree that is standing alongside the road. So it doesn't have an owner. It's just a fig tree out in the wild. Now, this tree has leaves on it, and Jesus sees that from a distance. Now, typically when a tree had leaves on it, it meant that the first figs were there. So Jesus had every right to assume that when he drew closer, he would be able to take figs off that tree and eat them. As he got closer, he found out that this wasn't the case. There was full leaf there. From all appearances, this tree looked like it was bearing fruit. But when you looked a little deeper, a little bit more closely, you saw that it was not. Now, Jesus curses this fig tree, and to some people this seems like that's pretty harsh. Why does Jesus just curse this tree out of nowhere? But really, Jesus is preparing the disciples for the lesson they will learn as he enters the temple in regard to bearing fruits of faith. So, Jesus goes into the temple and he cleanses it. The students probably will have heard this story before or have some of the visuals in their mind of Jesus going to the money changers with all their coins and flipping them over. And he goes to all the animal cages and he opens up the gates and he kind of shoos the animals out and makes them go out. So there's a pretty big scene. There's kind of uncharacteristic intensity from Jesus here. Normally we think of him as the peaceful teacher, the one inviting the kids to come forward to him and saying, let the little children come to me. But there was really great reason for Jesus to be upset here. It wasn't just that they were buying and selling outside of the temple. They were doing this in the one area where the Gentiles could worship. They had one spot where they could come into the temple and worship God, and that had been set up with these stands for buying and selling animals, with these money changers with the clattering of their coins. People would drop coins and that would be loud. What it's like on a farm when you have tons of animals in a small place, especially during the summer when the heat is just beating down on the people and baking this entire area. So you kind of get a pretty strong picture of what this was like, and then you have people trying to worship. So kind of use the picture with the kids that they can imagine if in the sanctuary we had a bunch of animals in there and people having a transaction like it's McDonald's or something. How would that feel to try to worship in there with all of this loud, raucous stuff going on? So that's what made Jesus so upset. Now, it appears the temple leaders were a part of this, that they had been corrupted. You figure, why wouldn't they put a stop to this? If this is that big of a deal, disrupting worship, why wouldn't they stop it? Well, it seems like they were getting part of the prophets here, and they could keep an eye on this by having this right outside the temple. So they were guilty here as well, of doing something very, very wrong and not acting as God expects his leaders to do. As we said, Jesus shows uncharacteristic intensity here. He had actually done this before, 3 years before, at the beginning of his ministry. John 2 records that time when he cleansed the temple before, and now it is a week before he is to die, and he has to do it again. You see that the people had forgotten his lesson over the course of only 3 years. And after Jesus cleanses at this time, he doesn't even allow one of the priest's assistants to take one of the worship utensils, a jar or something like that, and to cut through this court as a shortcut. He says, you're not even going to do that anymore. You're going to go all the way around because these people need to be focusing on worship and their love and thanksgiving for the true God. As far as the teaching points go, the people of the temple had lost all sense of the presence of God. You think about this tone and the the reverence of worship as we gather in God's house to worship Him. We think this is the Almighty Creator God who set us free from sin, when really He should have just wiped us off the face of the earth. And you want to keep those things in mind when you go to worship Him and understand that He deserves our respect and our honor and reverence. And these people had totally lost all sight of that. They weren't coming to God's house, they were coming to a place. And unfortunately, it'd become a place where people were pursuing their own interests. There's all these people here who weren't concerned about worship. This was just another place where they could go and make money. One of the big points here is God doesn't just want us to go through the motions of worship. He's not looking down on Sunday morning and seeing, okay, he's there, she's there, he's there, and doing a question mark, just the fact that we're there. That's almost a form of works righteousness, as in, I'm going to offer God my presence, and that'll be enough for Him. He'll settle for that. I was here physically in worship. I was sitting in that seat, God. Now, what are you going to do for me? How are you going to bless me? When we're there for worship, we have to be there truly worshiping God. It totally defeats the purpose if we just go and run through the motions. That's not pleasing to God. It's actually displeasing, and it's doing the same thing that these merchants were doing, making a mockery of God's house. One of the other points is that you see that God wanted His house to be a house for all nations. It wasn't just the Jewish people. It was the Gentiles here. His chief concern is that these Gentiles are not getting a chance to worship in the one spot they were allowed. That's really what made Him so frustrated, is that they were being denied a chance to show their love for God and to hear His word being preached. Ultimately, one of the biggest things from this lesson is Jesus is so disturbed by how far the Jewish people had fallen. They had once been a people who refused to even say the name of God for fear that they would somehow disrespect it. And over the course of the history of Israel, the temple was so big for them. When the Israelites went off into exile, we have some of the songs recorded in the poetry that they wrote to express some of their feelings about being exiled. And they just weep, partly because they were away from their homes, but partly because they were away from the temple. That was the place where they could go and worship God. And over the course of hundreds of years, it had stopped being that way. That now this was a place like any other place, a marketplace, and they had lost that love and that reverence, and Jesus sees that, and it hurts His heart. So that's why he does this very intense thing of cleansing the temple, because He wants to get them back there. He wants at least the Gentiles to see this isn't how it's supposed to be. This is supposed to be a place of worship where you can show your love for God. Okay, important things in this lesson. God bless your teaching.